heard of, Auckland. The capital is Wellington. Down here is Christchurch, and I'm right down here in the bottom area in the square box here of Dunedin. New Zealand is mainly composed of these 3 islands. We've got Stewart Island down here. We've got a southern island and a north island. We've got an alpine crest going up through the islands there, which divides the wetter west side to the drier east side over here. And we've got various mountain ranges that go up through the North Island. Of course, it's on a couple of fault lines, so earthquakes are quite common in New Zealand. The interesting thing is that although we're bigger in landmass than the United Kingdom, we only have 4 million people. So the UK has somewhere in the region of about 60 million people, whereas in New Zealand we've just got 4 million people. And over 1 million of those people live in Auckland region. Round about on the whole of the South Island, there's only about 1 million people at the most living on the South Island. So it's very sparsely populated. As I said in the previous slide, it was first colonized by humans less than 800 years ago. And this has very important repercussions on the animals that naturally occurred in New Zealand. Of course, when humans did colonize 800 years ago, they brought with them all their nasty mammalian pests. They brought with them rats and mice, and they actually brought some dogs with them as well. And of course, those animals since then, and further colonizations later on by the Europeans, brought in a lot of pest species. So at that time, before humans arrived, there were no native land mammals in New Zealand at all. And that's a really important thing, because all the animals that have evolved in New Zealand over the last 80 million years have evolved in the absence of mammals. There were no land mammals in New Zealand at all. There's a couple of species of bat, one species that's been around for a couple million years, but it's a very small bat that sometimes would forage on the forest floor. But those were the only mammals that naturally occurred in the forests of New Zealand. So what about the frogs in New Zealand? And that's what this talk's all about. And at the moment what we've got 4 endemic species, and these are the Liopelmatids, so these are all of the genus Liopelma. And we've got 3 introduced species from Australia, and they're in the genus Litoria. And these were only introduced in the late 1800s. So they've only been here for just over 130 years. And they were originally introduced to New Zealand by the early colonizers for a couple of reasons. They felt that it would be good for them to have noisy frogs in the pond, because there were no noisy frogs anywhere in the ponds in New Zealand. They felt they might help keep some of the insect pests down, and they also felt that it would be quite nice for some of the ducks that they were introducing to have something to eat. So these 2 big green monsters here, these are the loud raucous Australians that were introduced into New Zealand. In the foreground here, the warty one here is Litoria raniformis, and then in the background there we've got Litoria aurea, the green and golden bell frog. If we have a look at the map, and we really only needed to consider the North Island and the northern part of the South Island to see where most of the frogs occur. These are historical distributions. We can see that the yellowy orange color here is where we find Hochstetter's frogs, and we'll have a look at this in a bit more detail later on. But most of the frogs on the North Island, you could find 4 species of frogs, and probably Litoria ewingi in isolated patches, so maybe 5 species of these frogs on the North Island. We've got a couple of Liopelmatids that only occur in these little areas here on offshore islands that are free of predators, of course, free of introduced predators. And then on the South Island we have 2 introduced species that occur on the South Island. And we don't have any native frogs on the South Island at all. But interestingly enough, what we find is out of these 7 species that we have in New Zealand, 3 which have been introduced over 100 years ago, we have 6 globally threatened species. So out of those 7, we've got 6 globally threatened species. And that's an important thing to bear in mind as we go through today's webinar. So let's think about the endemic frogs, and that's the most important frogs that we could say that we've got in New Zealand. And of course these are evolutionarily ancient to most living amphibians. And David Canatella sent me this phylogeny here of frogs, which is a very interesting one to look at, and we find that we have the Liopelmatids way down here. So round about 200 million years ago, the Liopelmatids were hopping around, and they have changed very little in those 200 million years. And you can see from this phylogeny that they are quite ancestral to most other amphibians, and the modern Litoriids will be up here as part of the Neobatracha. So they are very evolutionary ancient to all the modern groups, and they share a number of primitive characteristics. An important thing to remember when we talk about Leiopelma is that they are K-selected species. And really this means that they invest in quality, so all their reproductive efforts, they put into quality rather than quantity. So most frogs, the ones that we think about, lay thousands of eggs, and they lay them, and they have these breeding frenzies, and you find an area of a pond where there's thousands and thousands of eggs laid by many couples, and they just leave their eggs to their own devices. They hatch into the tadpoles that we've all kept probably when we were children, and then the tadpoles metamorphose into little froglets. And obviously during that stage, then a lot of mortality occurs, and you get a lot of them dying off. So those are amphibians that put all their reproductive effort into quantity. Now Leiopelma put all their reproductive efforts into quality, and most of our native species will have about 12 eggs maximum. They probably only ever breed once every other year, or just when the conditions were right, and they look after their young, and they live a very long time. Some of the frogs that Professor Ben Bell from Victoria University has worked on, he's been marking those frogs, and they are the same frogs that he marked 40 years ago. So they are very long-lived species, and they put a lot of this energy into looking after their young. When we think about the unusual features, we find whenever you look at a picture, and we've got Archie's frog up in the top left-hand corner, we've got a Hamilton's frog down here in the bottom right-hand corner, notice that they don't have any external eardrum. So they've got no external ear, and they also don't have any middle ear. They've got an inner ear, so they do hear some of the very low frequency sounds, but they don't hear any of the sort of sounds that we would be making now as we're talking. And that's an unusual feature. There are quite a number of earless frogs out there, but it's a fairly unusual feature. Obviously, if they don't have any ears, there's not much point in making mating calls, so they don't produce hardly any calls at all. If you do molest them, they will squeak, and this is more of a release call, a bit of a stress call. Very interestingly, in the species that we studied, they have male parental care. So the males look after the babies, and they look after the metamorphing froglets as well. They also have an extra vertebrae, so these are all unusual features. Almost unique features is that they have these tail wagging muscles. And obviously this frog doesn't have a tail. The only other species that does have tail wagging muscles are the Scapha species, and they actually have, the males have an intromittent organ, which is sort of like a bit of a tail that can be used as a penis for inseminating the females. So our frogs, the Leiopelmas, don't have any intromittent organ. We suspect that they probably have external fertilization, and they have these tail wagging muscles. But very interestingly and uniquely, they are the only species of frog that has abdominal ribs. And when you look at these abdominal ribs, and I've got a nice slide here to show you these abdominal ribs, they have these 4 pairs of abdominal inscriptional ribs, and these are cartilaginous ribs that occur in the musculature of the ventral body wall. So in those belly muscles on the frog, which help it move its guts around a little bit as well, they have these inscriptional ribs, these cartilaginous ribs. And at the moment, the function of these ribs is unknown. Perhaps it protects them when they jump onto hard rocks or something like that, but we really don't know why they have these inscriptional ribs. But they're the only species of frog that has them. So they are quite a primitive species. When we look at the frogs in more detail, to have a look at what species we do have, and on all these slides,